It is my great privilege to introduce our next author, Bob Ryan. Bob is indisputably one of our greatest and most respected American sports writers. He retired from daily work at the Boston Globe in 2012 after 45 years at the paper. He's the author of many books and has been elected to 4 Halls of Fame, including the Basketball Hall of Fame, where he received the Kurt Gowdy Award. He continues to appear regularly on various ESPN shows and is a presence on radio shows throughout the country. Bob is here to discuss his most recent book, Scribe, My Life in Sports, which is a compelling, can't-put-it-down autobiography and description of the memorable events and personalities he has covered. Now, on a personal note, I've been a fan of Bob's literally from the time he began with the Globe in 1968. Might seem strange to those of you who know me because I'm a lifelong New Yorker and an avid fan of New York sports teams. But when I began coming to the Vineyard as a kid, and then in my teens, I discovered the Globe sports section, which was, to my eyes, even as a 15-year-old kid, was by far the best sports section in the country, and certainly better than anything that we had in New York. And it's had this amazing array of gifted writers. And for me, Bob quickly became the basketball guy, and then the baseball guy, and then the columnist to read. So I have continued throughout my life to read him and have marveled at his ability specifically to combine great writing with a passion for sports and, yes, even for Boston teams. So I won't wear my Yankee hat during this interview because this is not going to be crossfire or adversarial. This is all a fan talking to somebody that he's been following for many years.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you all for coming out and spending a few hours here today. This is great. It's a wonderful event. My first time. I've been enjoying myself thoroughly. Just do a few prefatory remarks about how the book came about. I would say I would be thoroughly and completely disingenuous if I were to suggest that at no point during my time at the Globe I hadn't thought about writing a book. I think any writer with a healthy ego and maybe even a hint of pomposity figures that he or she has a wonderful story to tell, and the world just can't wait to find it out. But I had tabled it, and really because I saw a couple of works from people whose I admired greatly that I thought didn't get the attention or the notoriety that they deserved, and I said, well, if they're not going places with the book, you're flattering yourself. Why? Who do you think you are? So don't forget about it. So I said, okay, fine. Then 2 strokes of good fortune resulted in a book taking place. The first one was that there exists on this earth a man named Andrew Blauner who happens to be an agent, a New Yorker, like a Manhattan guy, and not just a sports agent, but a general agent who happens to have an affinity and a passion for sports, particularly basketball. He had been an undergraduate at Brown during the Bird era, during the 80s, and became a reader of the Globe, much as David became one here, and of myself. And basketball being his sport, I'm the guy that he fixated on, if you will. And unbeknownst to me, he was a fan of mine. He approached me about 4.5 years ago about writing a book. And I thought, well, if Andrew Blauner thinks it's a good idea, and he's an agent, and he thinks he can sell it, and it might have a chance to do something, let's go. But I said the one thing I have to do is wait until I do retire to focus on this properly. And that is, I'll be doing that after the London Olympics. So I said, okay. So the London Olympics came and went, and we got a little proposal together. And that led to the second stroke of good fortune, which was that we walked into the office of George Gibson at Bloomsbury Publishing in New York. George and I had worked on a book in 1989. It was a book on the Celtics, and the book was primarily a photographic work the late great Dick Rayfield, one of the preeminent, frankly, New England sports photographer of the second half of the 20th century, and had a stash of Celtic book photos, and he wanted to get out there, and I wrote the accompanying text. And it is a mini history of the Celtics up to 1989, but as much a photographic work as it is a literary work. But George was the editor of that book, and at that time he worked for Addison Wesley in Reading, Mass. Now he had migrated to New York, and now he was happily for me not only the editor but the publisher. He's the cheese at Bloomsbury, and he happened to still be a Bob Ryan fan and a Celtic and a sports fan, and he was anxious to get the book, which was great for me. And it was great for me because Bloomsbury's turned out to be the best publishing experience I've ever had. This is my 12th book. I worked for a lot of publishers and I had a lot of editors and some excellent editors, but I've never had a publishing experience to rival this one. Bloomsbury being not a giant house where you get lost, not a teeny tiny house where they can't do something for you, but just the mama bear, the papa bear, and the baby bear, just the right size mama bear that can help you out. And they promoted this book. The general lament of 99.9% of all failed authors, and I know I can speak from great experience about being a failed author, is they didn't promote my book. Well, I couldn't say that here. It was great, and they were wonderful, and it's been a great ride. A little bit just briefly about process, because it was interesting. As I mentioned, it was the 12th book. Well, the first 11 were written while I was in the full-time employee of the Globe, which means that they're all written on nights, holidays, weekends, vacations. And it's a stressful thing, and it's always on your head, and you wake up every day, and it's there, and it's like a giant term paper hanging over your head. And it's miserable, and it's not fun. And writing books isn't, as a rule, isn't fun, and it certainly isn't fun under those circumstances. So no one uses the word fun very much when they're talking about the actual process, which leads me to the famous line of Dorothy Parker, who once said, "I don't like writing, I like having written." And most authors can very well relate to that. Well, this book was different. The first one I wrote in retirement, so I was actually able to write on a schedule. It was just my primary focus in life now was this book. Everything else was secondary. So I had a schedule, and I had a 4-day-a-week writing schedule. 5th day I did save for TV, ESPN and Comcast. I called it Make Money Monday, and it kept and it worked out great. So I was able to write the book on a schedule, no stress. It was borderline fun. It wasn't good. Plus, I liked the subject matter. I kind of liked the guy, so that worked out. I was happy to foster him. So that was good. So the process made the book easier to write than anything else. I hope it showed in the product. Finally, before we get to a little dialogue here, here's what the book isn't. It is not the angry screed of an aging, embittered veteran sports writer telling you all the things that are wrong with sports. Okay, it's out there. They have those books. They're out there, and I could have written something like that if I chose to. There is a lot long. I'd love to change. I like to wave the magic wand over all kinds of things. Well, okay, we can even talk about that. That's fine. But that wasn't what the book is. I wanted to reflect the idea that somewhere out there is an aging sports writer who still likes it. And I didn't quit because I was bored or was frustrated no, it was time for a variety of reasons to step back and let somebody else do it and move on to another phase of life and enjoy stuff and achieve flexibility, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. So the book is a positive book reflecting the experiences and enthusiasm of somebody who has liked this life. I rather enjoyed the stuff. So that's what it is. It's very, very generally a positive book, and I think that'll reflect the fact that what I think does, quite frankly, separate me from so many of my peers, and sometimes as young as 30 when they get this way, is that I think not enough of them are really motivated by the essence of the whole thing, which is the games. In other words, you hear people say, well, I only like to write about people. I never root for anybody. I don't care who wins and loses. And even people who cover teams say that, which I have never been able to understand. If you're spending a lot of time on a daily basis on the course of weeks and months and years and you don't develop some kind of an affinity for the people you're working with, I just don't relate to that. But anyway, so I said, well, fine, it's easy to write about people. Really, it's not that hard. If you have a proper background and you've got the command of the language and you have some sensitivity and some compassion and some humor, you can write about people. There are 6 I would say player personal profiles in the book about people that are, but to me that's a layup drill. I'm not that impressed you can write about people. I think you ought to be able to write about that as a prerequisite for being a writer of any kind, let alone a sports writer. But what unites the people who all come and go, think about this, there isn't one person in prominence in sports in any capacity, including ownership, that was prominent in 1968 when I started, who is still prominent today. And it makes sense. They all come and go. But what unites them all? The game. It's all about a game. It's all about the competition. That's what it's all about, is it not? That's what it's all about. So if you don't have an endemic interest, inherent interest in that, I can see how you would get very bored with the whole thing. But I still care about, the games. They fascinate me, and who wins and loses. And so whether it's a Bulgarian weightlifter at the Olympics, or whether it's Clayton Kershaw, now the latest guy going for the scoreless innings record, if you haven't heard, it's all about the game. And I still like the games. So that keeps me going. And that I think accounts for the reason why the book is a positive book. So with that, I will stop there, and let's go to phase 2 here.
Is this working? Yeah. Okay. So Bob, let's jump right into it. You in the book you wrote about a couple of things I found very interesting. One was you wrote about a little bit about the secret to a good basketball team and the keys and all of that. And then you also write about the keys to good sports writing.
Yes.
And sort of the secret of that. And in case there's any doubt about Bob's credentials as a great writer, he talks about in the book one of his great fans who he corresponded with was John Updike. And so I'm wondering if you could just give us a little idea of your thoughts about being a great sports writer.
Well, it's a two-part word, sports writing. And the first part takes care of itself if you're going to be in this business, obviously. I mean, just by you're a sports fan, which means you're watching, you're playing, you're involved in sports. It's in your blood. You care about it. That's obvious. That's the first prerequisite for being a sports writer. But that's the easy part. I mean, that alone would qualify vast numbers of people. It's the second part that separates us from them. That's a little us and them thing. And the writing thing was another inherent thing that I can't account for. I mean, the DNA from my father about being in sports, which is well documented in the book, just suffice it to say, I was born into a family in which I do not, and I mean this is literal, it is not hyperbolic, I do not remember a time in my life when we weren't going to a game, when I was young, going to a game, coming from a game, getting ready to go to another game. It was always about a game. It was whether a minor league baseball game in Trenton, New Jersey, where I grew up, whether it was a college basketball game at the Palestra, whether it was a high school basketball game, whether it was a American Legion baseball game, didn't matter, whatever. It was, that's my life. Yeah, with Tom Gola, right, the 1954 LaSalle championship team. So that's all I knew, and that's because of who my father was and the way I grew up. Now, that doesn't account for the part B, and part B is the lucky part for me, which is the only reason I'm sitting here today in this capacity, which is my father would take me to a high school basketball game. Well, definitely a high school basketball game. Trenton Catholic was a major power in New Jersey in the 1950s on a Friday night. And on Saturday morning, I could not wait to get to the Morning Trentonian, the paper, to read about that game. Because until I read about that game, it wasn't validated. It wasn't real. It wasn't substantive. It didn't happen in my head. That's the way I was. I like the words, I like the writing, but I wanted to learn, read was that the game I saw, what did the writer think, etc. But it was important to have it validated. And I was a reader. And this isn't a normal 7-year-old reaction. I think you'll all agree to that. Or 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old. But that was me. So by the time I was 9 years old, they knew the thing to give me for Christmas was easy, reading material. So I was given a subscription to both Sport Magazine, which was indispensable for anybody growing up in the 50s, and Sporting News, which was indispensable if you were a baseball fan, when I was 9. Okay, I had subscriptions to both, and I was given a book when I was 9 for Christmas called Modern Baseball Strategy by Paul Richards, the manager then of the Orioles and the White Sox. And it was a book about baseball, and from that I learned about the construction of a batting order and the cutoff, how to hit the cutoff man, and all this stuff. And I absorbed it all, and I loved that book, and I still have that book in my bookshelf in my office at home. So anyway, the two to go together, and then that's and then from that point on, I was very fortunate in that I was able to develop this aptitude. I love the word aptitude. That's all it is. And my aptitude is for words. And, the left brain, right brain thing, I mean, I am so one-sided, it's sick about the, no mechanical ability whatsoever. But words, I'm great with words. So that's it. And I was able to develop that both for the Mercy Nuns at St. Joseph's School, and then the teachers at Lawrenceville School, and then the writing at BC, and then the people that I work with at the Globe, and here we are.
You mentioned your background in Trenton, New Jersey. I think many of us, including me, would be or were very surprised to learn that you're not a Boston guy, but came from New Jersey and then made that transition to being so associated with Boston and Boston sports. How did that come about?
Well, that happened it just gradually, naturally. I went to Boston College. And at that point, and I could have easily have gone to there's long stories, but it was BC Georgetown kind of coin flip. And that time, I just basically chose Boston over Washington in my head. I had no connection with either, and it turned out to put me on a path to get an internship at the Globe, and then, I mean, unlike most writers, my story is highly atypical. I mean, if the background was atypical, then the process was equally atypical, because I could be the only, I mean literally, capital O, the only columnist at a major newspaper in America in the last, a sports columnist in the last 30 years, 40 years, 50 maybe, who worked only at one paper. I mean, every other writer that you name, big name columnist you can think of, I'm telling you, every one of them worked at least one other paper, if not two or three. Yeah. Oh my God, Red Smith started out in Philadelphia. All right, so he's, but the point is, I was the exception. So I didn't pay those dues at the small town paper, the weekly, and then moving up. No, I was at the Globe, and I stayed there. That's it, 44 years at the Globe. So I became, immersed in Boston lore. I went up there knowing, very little. I mean, other than the Red Sox and Ted Williams and the Celtics, naturally. The Celtics were the height of the Celtics when I got there, 64, height of Bill Russell era. So I learned it all. I studied the high school stuff. I had to learn it. I covered lots of high school sports for years and years and years. Learned the high school rivalries. Learned the, here's how you learn the area. You get assigned to a football game. You got to learn how to drive there. I mean, I learned the greater Boston by driving to high school football and then basketball games and baseball games. And that's how I learned my geography of greater Boston. And so I became immersed in Boston lore, and then I became associated with Boston, and I'm very proud to be associated with Boston. But it all but I'm still proud to be a Jersey guy and proud to be a Trenton guy, and I do devote maybe a disproportionate amount of this book to this whole thing about Trenton. But I thought it was very important for me to establish this roots thing, if you will, about how I got where I am, and I do owe a lot to growing up in Trenton.
Trenton makes and the world takes, right?
The sign on the bridge, I'm sure many of you know that bridge, taking that train ride from New York to Washington, and you go through that Trenton, and the sign, it was like so many eastern cities 100 years ago, it was a thriving industrial city with all kinds of activity, and now it's a typical decaying eastern city, and then that's the way the world is going.
Bob, as I noted in my intro, and I think you referenced it yourself in your opening remarks, I've always been so impressed by your ability to simultaneously remain objective, yet to also clearly root and have passion for the sports and for the home teams in Boston. And so many writers seem to feel they have to choose one approach or the other approach. And I'm wondering, how do you do that?
The number one thing is whichever approach you choose, it's got to be the one that's natural for you. You can't force it. You can't. If the audience finds out, the readers find out after a relatively short period of time when a guy's faking it, and so it's my natural instinct. I mentioned it earlier. The games. I'm a fan. See, so many writers pride themselves on sports writers, detachment. All right, fine. I have a good friend. I won't even mention his name because I don't want to. He may dispute this, but I'm amazed at his ability to be as good as he is when he really doesn't care. Honest to God, it's amazing. He doesn't care who wins or loses. He doesn't care. But he's a terrific writer, and he knows sports, and he gets the job done, and he does it his way, and it's his way, and he's totally comfortable in his skin. I can't be that way. I'm my way. I'm emotional. I'm passionate, and I'm also a fan. Everything is rooted for me in fandom. It's not the scholarly, the ivory tower detachment thing. It's a coming from a viewpoint of a fan who sat in the bleachers in Fenway in '67, who went to all these games and rooted and growing up, and who still was a season ticket holder. I was a 22-year season ticket holder of the Celtics from 78 to 90, to 2000, and we're 20 in our 22nd year as a season ticket holder for the Red Sox. I like going to games, and anyway, so the trick is how do you go from the journalist to the writer, the fan during the game to the journalist? I don't see how it's that hard. You have your fan, I can sit there and watch the game, and I'm pulling for him emotionally, silently. Hopefully it's silent, of course, to do well. And then, hey, it doesn't go well, somebody screws up, the game's bad, they play poorly, you put on your journalist hat, and you write the game. I don't think it's that hard. Not for me. It's not that hard. Now, you have to learn how to strike the balance, there's no question. But once again, it's all about being true to yourself and your personality. I couldn't write it the other way, and my friend in question, he's appalled sometimes, thinking about the way I went about it. But he's terrific, and I've had some success my way.
So let's get into some of the actual sports discussions that come up in your book. Of course, you're known to many as the premier basketball writer and expert on the NBA. And in this year's NBA playoffs, the biggest story seemed to be whether or not LeBron could lead his injury-riddled and talent-free team to a championship. At times, it looked like LeBron and the Knicks to me. And then the question that got raised and is you address in your book is whether he had surpassed Michael as the greatest of all time. What's the verdict?
Yeah, I have a chapter of LeBron versus Michael because I think it's I find their stories fascinating, as they both, Michael reached past tense and LeBron has reached present tense, the pinnacle of being the best individual practitioner of the art. Let's just put it that way, okay? Of their time, and I think that elevates them to the two best practitioners of the art, individually detached from the whole of all time. And what makes them interesting is the diverse personality there, and the way they each were developed, if you will. Michael Jordan's from old school. Michael Jordan was not known outside the state of North Carolina until he burst upon the scene as a freshman. The rest of us did not know who Michael Jordan was. He wasn't a national ballyhooed recruit. He was a guy who had just gone by the pattern of growing up in Wilmington, North Carolina. He may have played in some all-star games, but he wasn't famous for the way a lot of high school players are. And then, of course, he played for Dean Smith at North Carolina in this system, in a very rigid, structured system, which actually smothered him to a degree. I always say there were two kinds of Dean Smith players when it comes time to evaluate them for the NBA, the kind that are protected by the system and the kind that are smothered by the system. And he was one of the many that was smothered by the system. The old line about the only person that could hold Michael Jordan under 20 was Dean Smith, was a lot of truth to that. Oh, all right, now, so LeBron is the poster child of the modern era, the AAU pup. LeBron James became known nationally, first in Ohio and then nationally by the time he was 16. And we first heard about this phenomenon of this kid at St. Vincent St. Mary High School in Toledo, LeBron James, and he wound up on the cover of Sports Illustrated while still in high school. And he was a nationally known commodity, and he had traveled the country over at these all-star games, which is what you do now in that AAU circuit when you reach that level, unimaginable to Michael Jordan. I would just give you a quick aside on what the difference is. I once did a story with Doc Rivers about his son, David's Notre Dame guy, the kid with the Clippers. Yeah, right. And I said, this is when he was entering his senior year, and I said, he told me how his son had spent the entire year, this summer, he was in Vegas, he was in this place, he was in that place. And I said, tell me about your senior year in high school. Doc Rivers was a great high school player in Chicago. He was a great high school player in another era. He said, well, you get up in the morning and with his two friends, and they would find out where the game was going to be tonight, the game. There's going to be a big game somewhere. There were 2 or 3 playgrounds. His two friends, by the way, were Terry Cummings and Mark Aguirre. And they would go to the site and they'd play. But meanwhile, they had jobs. They mowed lawns and stocked shelves, and they had jobs. The summer jobs. Oh, well, his son has never had a job in his life, and as these kids don't today. So anyway, LeBron is the poster child of this entire era. Now, that's number one difference. How they and he didn't go to college, and he went right to the NBA. But the difference is in their personalities. I maintain, this is the Bob Ryan premise, So, you're free to dispute it. I maintain that the essential difference between them and how they got there is that Michael only got to be a champion, only became a champion when he learned how to share. And LeBron only got to be a champion when he learned how to accept the responsibility of being the best player on the court and acquiring a little selfishness. LeBron is too nice a guy. Michael, the last thing in the world you say about him is he's too nice a guy on the court. Michael Jordan is the ultimate cut your heart out and serve it back to you, with a nice bottle of Chianti, okay? Whereas LeBron is knock you down, pick you up kind of guy. And also, did anybody see the documentary More Than a Game on LeBron and his okay? Now, what is the big takeaway from that 4-year documentary that's following him in high school? They won 3 state championships. And most tellingly, lost it as a junior, so spent the whole year in a senior year waiting to get it back and vindicate themselves. The takeaway is that LeBron was the best player, and they all knew it. And LeBron also kind of knew it. But he didn't exploit it socially in any way. Did not exploit it socially. And he not only wanted to win, he wanted to win with those guys, my guys. He has always all been about team. He has. He's always been about team. And so, the big knock on him was the 2011 finals. I was a late convert. All right. Did he run away from the ball? Did he look like? Yes. He shrunk against the Mavericks. I think it was a turning point and the catharsis for him because from that point on, he doesn't shrink from the ball. I mean, he's won the 2 titles, and what he did this year, I thought, was the greatest individual accomplishment I've ever seen in the NBA. Very analogous to what Larry Bird did with Indiana State in 1979, taking that team to the finals. And they might have won against a lesser team. Remember, they were up against a Golden State team that is going to go down in history, I think, as one of the great one-season teams of all time. We'll see what they do with the rest of their career. But they were 67-15 in a rigorous Western Conference. They won it by 11 games, and they won the championship. It's one of the best single-season teams. They played a great team. There were a lot of lesser teams playing for the title that the Cavaliers may very well have beaten. So, but the difference, once again, the personalities. One had to learn how to share. Remember, Michael finally, he gets a great teammate in Pippen, and then, he winds up passing the ball off for a game-winning basket to Paxson, and another one there were 2 guys he did it to. Steve Kerr. So that wasn't possible for him early. And remember, the essence of basketball is Pete Carrillo is 5 guys, 1 ball. There's a very delicate dynamic there, which LeBron has always known, and which Michael reluctantly came to grips with. Well, he had other guys. He had Horace Grant. They had good teammates.
So obviously, basketball has been your passion, and you played basketball a little bit back in your high school days. Yep. And one of the things I always enjoy doing and talking with other basketball fans is putting together the greatest teams of all time, talking who's better than who. One thing I was really interested in is, and for those who looks like there's enough people here who's basketball watching would go back quite a ways, which it's necessary for you to. I'm in that group too, and it's necessary for this next question. But Bob, one of his favorite people, I think it's fair to say, reading on the book, is John Havlicek, and your opinion of John Havlicek is that he was essentially the greatest player of his time, maybe better than Oscar and Jerry.
He was. Here's the thing. He doesn't get mentioned in this conversation because Oscar Robertson was so transcendent, and Jerry West, God knows we love him, the logo, and he was a great all-around player. My premise is simply this, that by 1969, Oscar was now aging and slightly on the downside. Jerry was clearly, and once again, great, fine player, all league, but not at their peak. And John was at his peak. And from 1969 to 1974, he was a better player. First of all, he was a 2-position player, which neither of them were. He played their position, and he played another position, and he played them both at an all-star, at the highest possible level. No, he started at Ohio State. He started, look, please. He started, he was...
You can do it later. Let's let Bob talk.
Okay. Now, so my premise is that he was a better player than them for those 5 years. He was the best player in the league, without question, individual player. Once again, we have the centers. That's another discussion. We're having a basketball discussion. We have to render the centers to things that are centers, and to the other position players the things that are the other position players, because that's where we get into all these debates about who's the greatest. People say, well, what about Wilt, and what about Russell, and what about Kareem? Yes, they are the 3 best centers without any question of all time. We can have that argument, but all-around player, passing, dribbling, defending, shooting. Centers aren't called upon to do all those other things. They have their job description. But the other guys have their job description, and then that job description is a handful of people competing for the title of the greatest player. We mentioned Michael and Lebron, I think, emerge right now as the two best. But the next three up the scale for me are Oscar and Jerry and Havlicek.
And I guess then 1986 comes along, and the Celtics have that great team, and they win the championship. And I think you expressed the opinion that they're the greatest team of all time.
I believe that firmly, and the trump card on that one is it's very simple. You can accept it or reject it as irrelevant, and then, you're not going to buy the premise. No, there have been a lot of great teams, and there have been a lot of great six men. The greatest, the acclaimed one being John Havlicek over a period of time as a Boston Celtic. But no team ever brought a commodity such as Bill Walton off the bench as a six-man. And the way he affected and the altered games night in and night out, dynamically affected the game in a way to make them the greatest 1-2 center combination ever. This part, no one can argue, was Robert Parrish in 1986 and Bill Walton together. And having Bill Walton, who that year did win the Six-Man Award, had a remarkably blissful, healthy season. That he played the most games he ever played in his injury-marred career that year, 80 games. The two injuries, the games he missed, had nothing to do with his famously messed up feet. And one was when he had a broken nose, and one was when he was sick. And played all but one playoff game. That was a miracle year that they benefited from. And Bill Walton, who I hold a special place as a player, made them a different time of great team. I think the two best teams I ever saw in my time were the 86 Celtics and the 86-87 Lakers the very next year. That's the greatest series that never was. If we could have had the 86 Celtics against the 87 Lakers, boy, that would have been. I like to barnstorm the country, best out of 101 for that one.
And I guess we can say that those two teams are different than any kind of team we would ever see now, in the sense of how many great players they had, the depth of the teams, the number of Hall of Famers on the team. I would think we're never going to see teams like that again.
Great point. The depth thing, and that's all about expansion. Let's start with the reason. Every sport, I think all of us who love whatever sport you love, if you feel there are too many teams. Okay, we all know that. All right, now, so we start with that premise. I used to do this little cocktail napkin late night at the bar exercise in the 90s, okay? I would write down about anywhere from 12 minimum to 15 names on a napkin. And the names would be Walton, Kupchak, Wilkes, Bobby Jones, Vinnie Johnson, Scott Wedman, Danny Ainge, Kevin McHale, Bob McAdoo, on and on, Jamal Wilkes, Keith Wilkes. All right, that's it. Got to about 12. I said, what do these names have in common? And no, I mean, maybe one or two people ever got it. And then now after some severe coaching, because they were kind of, well, yeah. Every name I mentioned, of James Worthy, let's throw that one in there, okay? Every name I mentioned, those guys came off the bench for at least one full season on each of one of the four teams that won the championships in the 80s. Only four teams won championships in the 80s. The Lakers, the Celtics, the 76ers, and the Pistons. We're talking about Hall of Famers eventually. We're talking about perennial all-stars. We're talking about great, great players. My premise is I put the best team of those together. I think they beat any of the Bulls teams. Any of them. Even the 72-win team. I'll take my team. They always start with the premise, who's going to guard McHale? Good luck. Not Dennis Rodman. I got news for you. So point being, depth. Nobody can afford to bring a player like that off the bench today, except the closest thing was what Steve Kerr did this year with Iguodala in Golden State. A man who would start on every game he had ever showed up for in the NBA was asked after like a 6 or 7 year career to come off the bench, which he did with great distinction and helped them win the championship. That's the closest thing we have in the game today. And is he in the category with the best of those players I mentioned? No, he's in the next level, but he's still a fine player. But point being, depth. So no, nobody today has that kind of depth. Nobody has you couldn't imagine bringing a Kevin McHale off the bench today. He did it for years. So that's all about expansion.
So I'm getting the signal that we're reaching the end of our time, which is unfortunate because I have 3 or 4 hours more questions, and I'm sure everybody could listen to you for that long. And of course, I guess I would be remiss if I didn't end up just by asking the question of, how come the Red Sox are so terrible now?
Yeah, because there were bad, obviously there were bad judgments. Just as in the offseason of prior to the 2013 season, Ben Cherington signed 7 free agents, and 6 of them had arguably career years, and the 7th one had a decent year and hit the jackpot with them all, and they were instrumental in them winning. The moves this past season have turned out to be almost not only bad but counterproductive. I mean, let's face it. Pablo Sandoval has been a basic disaster. Vic Basello has the worst DRA of any starter in the majors. And on it goes. Hanley Ramirez has been erratic, to say the least. And so we can go down the list. Joe Kelly finally won a game yesterday, in which he gave up 5 earned runs in 5 innings, but got the win anyway. So the judgments were bad, and judgments were good 2 years ago. But things can turn around relatively quickly. They do have 2 great young players, potentially great, in Bogarts and Betts. So, but pitching, we'll see.
Thank you, Bob. It's been great talking to you.
You're welcome. Yeah.